Hello, everybody. Another session of Lunch with Doc. And, I just thought this would be a really important session for college basketball coaches across the country. Last week when we had, Dr. Seelig and Mark Benson on, we talked a little bit about scheduling and some of the challenges that were out there for athletic departments and college basketball programs. So I thought one of the things that everybody had been talking about is scheduling. And if you remember, a couple of years ago, we had Kevin Pauga come out and talk to the group out in Las Vegas about scheduling. And of course, Kevin being an associate AD at Michigan State, but he also has become kind of one of the national leaders in the whole concept of scheduling. And he probably has been involved with not only Big Ten scheduling, but a lot of Power Five ideas, but also I think he's very in tune with a lot of things that are going on in college basketball in regard to scheduling. One of the things, I wanted to also kind of share with all of you is we do have a TopConnect YouTube channel. So if you want to subscribe to that, you can go back and see any of our old Lunch with Doc sessions. And one other thing I wanted to mention also is I've also created a YouTube channel with Coach Mike Smith, the former coach of the Atlanta Falcons and three-time NFL Coach of the Year. We basically have a podcast that we've developed called we call it From the Locker Room with Coach and Doc. And so we're going to bring people in who are kind of have a lot of experience, can share their thoughts on coaching, leadership. And just for example, yesterday we did a podcast with Brian Billick, of course, who was the head coach of the Baltimore Ravens when they won the Super Bowl in 2000. It was interesting to hear him talk about, some of the relationships he had with not only his assistant coaches. He had 9 coaches on his staff who went on to be NFL head coaches, but also guys like Ray Lewis and Shannon Sharp and Ed Reed. So I think that's going to be really good. So we're just kind of waiting here for Kevin. He was on another call. He's scrambling to get off. So I think we think Kevin's here. So there's Kevin. How you doing, Kevin?
Good to see you, Doc. Thanks for having me.
Well, I appreciate you being here. I think this is such a timely episode for us. I know you probably have studied it and have about as good an idea as anybody about what's going on in the world of college basketball scheduling. I guess if anybody has any, I don't know if anybody has all the answers, but I'm sure you've done a lot of work on it. And I guess one of the things, with the council coming out yesterday and setting some of the guidelines for this year, I guess, what are your basic thoughts now that I know you studied a lot? Where do you see this whole scheduling world right now?
Yeah, so appreciate you having me, and good to see a lot of familiar faces. Just kind of as an overarching point to start, what the council essentially did yesterday was postpone the start date with both the men's and women's sides to November 25th. So it's 15 days later than originally anticipated, the Wednesday night before Thanksgiving. Additionally, they reduced the maximum number of contests by 4 games per team. And so what that essentially means is that on the men's side, if you're playing in an MTE, you can play 27 games. If you're not playing in an MTE, you can play 25 games. And on the women's side, where the MTE legislation is a little bit different, you can play 25 games with no MTE. And then if you're in an MTE, you can play 23 games plus the MTE. So a little bit of a technicality there on the women's side, just based on how the MTE games are counted. But essentially, on the women's side also, if the MTE does expand to as much as 4 games, you end up hitting 27 games. There's some contractual issues. I'll try to take this chronologically, starting at November 10th. Many of our contracts for the games between November 10th and 24th, they all have kind of the boilerplate language that we all use. And those 15 days of games are going to be less about the force majeure, putting my legal hat on, and more about that first paragraph that appears in many of them related to NCAA rules. Because of how the council acted and in terms of changing the actual legislation with the emergency legislation passed yesterday, What that now means is that games signed in those period, by definition, are a violation of the NCAA rules related to the start of play. So it's obviously creating a whole lot of consternation, as folks try to prioritize the games that they want to get played, and figure out, hey, I've got a rivalry game that's just down the road that's in early November. This game's a priority. I really want to reschedule that. I've got some games that are past November 25th, that I don't want to bail on my opponent, but you may have more games scheduled than you're allowed now if you were backloaded with some of your schedules. So from that standpoint alone, what I've encouraged, for folks that I've talked to, some of which are on this call and in conversations with many folks, is to try and prioritize the non-conference games that you currently have scheduled. I'll speak very candidly relative to Michigan State's schedule on the men's side. The Big Ten plays 20 conference games, which means that including the MT, we had 11 non-conference windows to potentially schedule. I'll tell you that we never filled the 10th and 11th window. We were waiting, in one case, just based on how some conference games fell, and we made the decision this summer, which was a roll of the dice. It's worked out, but we could have looked very foolish if it worked out differently. But we only had 8.5 games to kind of start. So we've kind of worked backwards from there, and try to prioritize where not necessarily the importance of games, but the importance of windows and the control that we have around said games. For instance, our MTE has to be the most important game on our most important series of games on our schedule right now. Not necessarily because it's more important, less important than anything else that's going on, but because it doesn't affect us and one opponent. It affects us and 7 other opponents and a television network and all these other parties. So in some ways, what we're doing is we are starting with a blank slate. That'll ensue some panic, as to making it sound more challenging than maybe it is. But within that blank slate, that gives us the opportunity to place those top priority games or top priority windows or the MTE kind of on the calendar first, based on when promoters may keep things on a schedule or may move things on a schedule. And then past that, that's where you can start to fill games back in, and they may end up right back where they were. But that concept, and that approach to it, hopefully will bring some level of organization to this whole undertaking. Again, we're trying to take a year or two's worth of schedules that we've spent all this time on, and undo them and redo them in the span of just a couple weeks. And as challenging a task as that is, we can't make it more challenging by being territorial about our schedules. We need to share information. I'll hit on this at some point that we've been working on a platform even pre-COVID called Factor, that we've launched in the last week or so, and we've had a couple hundred folks already sign up and start entering their schedules, and so I'm going to stop well short of calling it a success yet, but the idea there is that if we've got a real-time kind of clearinghouse of non-conference schedules that where we're essentially tracking on it, not approving, disapproving, not trying to take control from any coach that wants to build their schedule. That's not the point. The point is more about sharing information. The point is more about being able to search that, hey, I really need a game on December 19th, or I'm looking for a pod or an MTE. Tell me the 50 schools that are available on December 19th, and then sort them by mileage to my campus. So sort them by geography, so that you guys can have that information, because the old school way of doing it, where we would all call 50 schools and collect that information and then go to our coach, and the coach would make a decision. By time you get to that 50th school, the 10 schools that your head coach or your AD or whoever it is willing to play, most of those teams aren't going to have that data available by the time you get 24 hours into that process. So we've got to have that rapid approach. The other part, there's going to be games that are lost. There's going to be feelings that are hurt. And I think that as collaborative of an approach as we can have, I'm sure that several of you have more games on your schedule past November 25th than is currently allowed. And so just by default, something's got to give, something's got to go. So how do those conversations take place? If it's a home and home, does it just get pushed to a future year? If you haven't started the series, can you reset or even cancel the series? If it's a guarantee game, which is probably the trickiest because it's a single game, there's all sorts of things that are kind of tied into that guarantee game. You've got sellers in the guarantee market that are trying to hit a certain threshold for a budgetary purpose. You've got buyers in that same market that in some cases sign contracts under the idea that they would have 10,000 fans at the game. Well, that's not a thing. So how do you work through those contracts in order to make everybody feel as good as possible? And just a couple ideas there related to trying to turn a 1-game guarantee into a 2-game guarantee, where maybe you front load the guarantee this year, and then somebody comes back a second time for a lesser guarantee. So you kind of spread some dollars out that way in order to try. I'll call it robbing Peter to pay Paul, but some level of creativity may be needed there. The idea in terms of spacing of dates, that's squeezing games in, because you've got an MT that now needs to end up in a certain space. The idea of playing somebody on short prep is just going to have to be somewhat of a thing this year, because even as games are rescheduled, that could prove challenging. So that's kind of it on the guarantee games that are certainly out there from a contractual standpoint, as it relates to that side of it. The last point I want to hit before we maybe turn this more into a discussion than me just talking and dominating the conversation is as it relates to the analytics side of it, and specifically to postseason selection and seeding. That's going to be a moving target this year, and how the data looks. Net is in its third year on the men's side. It's going to be introduced for the first time on the women's side this year. Depending on the level of cross-pollination of non-conference, depending on how many games you even play in conference, if you end up with a situation where one team plays 10 games and another plays 18, it creates some of the same challenges relative to non-conference. Net is actually better equipped than RPI to be able to handle limited non-conference data and limited cross-pollination. It doesn't mean that it's going to be perfect. It doesn't mean that everything about this season is going to be fair. I'm not in that room, so I don't want to even try to speculate as to what that's all going to look like. But unfortunately, it's not going to be fair. It's not going to be fair in terms of number of games. It's not going to be perfect in terms of selection. The success of this season, in my mind, means that we're having a season, and that we're able to crown a conference champion in your respective conference, or that we're able to have an NCAA tournament and try to make it as fair as possible along the way. So the analytics are I would term them more to be determined than complete garbage at this point. I think that it's possible that we may get good enough data where they're somewhat useful. I'm actually maybe more optimistic than some as it relates to that. But where it's going to be critical for committee members is that they're going to need to dig even deeper as to what the meaning of some of those data points are, and some of the meaning behind what rankings are trying to quantify, and kind of paint that narrative that comes with those rankings. So So that's a lot relative to just kind of a starting point. But again, instead of me just taking what I think we want to talk about, Doc, if it's okay with you, I'd kind of like to let some people off mute and let's maybe have more of a conversation and take this where people want to go.
That'd be great, Kevin. Let me ask you a question.
Yeah.
There's been so much discussion and talk in the media about, these bubbles or pods, as you call them. I mean, do you think those are really going to happen? I know some of the promoters are kind of the major facilitators, but a lot of schools have also looked to do some of these things. And I mean, we saw things, some models that had, 20-day pods where you play 10 or 11 games. I mean, what is your feel? You've talked to a lot of people around the country. What's your feel about that?
So right now, I think that there's actually more pods than teams that are able to play in some of these pods. And not knocking anybody that may be involved in one of these, because the concept of a pod, it makes sense. But I worry that some of them could be cost prohibitive. I also worry that again, I'll just use Michigan State's numbers. We're playing 20 conference games. We've only got 7 non-conference games to schedule, and that needs to include our MTE. So if the MTE isn't part of this pod, take 3 games off, I'm down to 4 games. And oh, by the way, the Big Ten ACC Challenge, I'm down to 3 games. Like at that point, going and playing in a 20-day pod becomes impractical. And I think that existing contracts are going to bear that out. I think that what these pods are going to ultimately look like, it's going to be more mini pods that are encompassing of your MTEs. You might be at the same site as another MT and you pick up another game before you leave town. But then additionally, there's some campuses that have hosted their own MTEs in the past. You'll bring 3 more teams to campus. You get 4 teams total. And you play a 3-game round robin, or you play a semifinals one night and then a consolation championship the second night. I think that those as MTEs or those as just 3 countable contests make a little bit more sense, because it maintains some flexibility in terms of dates. I think that it's more cost effective, and ultimately a little bit more achievable. So some of these grand plans look like, I've seen several of them. There's some that have testing buttoned up, and they've got all these things that they've clearly spent a lot of time on over the last couple weeks and months. It's very evident that more than a few fall into that bucket. But at some point, it's who's paying for it. And one of the tricks of it of that side of things is also the broadcast rights. Depending on your respective conference, and already down 4 games per team for each of your conference members, as it relates to any conference television agreements that you may or may not have. Taking more and more of those games out of region hurts the value of that TV contract. So there's major financial ramifications that I think, frankly, it's going to be playing an MTE, maybe create a mini pod of a couple teams on campus, sprinkle in a few regional games. You've got a few other games that are under contract. I think that those 4 buckets are going to pretty much encompass most everybody's non-conference schedules, to the extent that non-conference schedules can exist on certain campuses.
Do you foresee, some conferences expanding their time frame for their conference schedule to try to accommodate in case there is a situation where it's test positive, so that they have some time to backload their schedule to move games back into the season?
Yeah, so what you've seen in the football schedules that have been created in terms of the conference football schedules is collapsibility in a lot of those games where 2 teams might be playing on October 3rd and they've got a matching bye week somewhere in November, so that a game can be rescheduled seamlessly should it be unable to be played in October. That's a little bit more challenging in basketball. But what I know I've heard loud and clear, and I'm guessing that most others have as well, is that there is a priority around trying to maximize conference contests. That everybody wants to try and get as many of their conference games in as possible. I think that there's a few conferences out there that are still trying to contemplate what that looks like. I think that most have a desire to play non-conference to the extent that that they're able to play non-conference, and I think that that's kind of the starting point as it relates to that. I think that at very early levels, that the idea of trying to front load a conference schedule and leave some room on the back end of it, just not knowing what you don't know, is the best way to achieve the maximum number of conference games that you can. Like, where can we reschedule a conference game? How do we create space to be able to do that? Is that a universal bye week late in the season? Is that, if you're in a divisional schedule, is that taking, hey, the East Division is going to be off this week and the West Division is going to be off the second week because you don't want the conference to completely go dark for a week because of whatever, television or whatever it might be. I think that those are the best options, but realistically, and I don't want to be Debbie Downer on all this, but there's going to be 5,000 college basketball games scheduled. Something's not getting played. Something's getting canceled because of COVID, and that number. Again, we've got football to use as an example, and the number of football games that have been called off or moved or adjusted is pretty high. And to think that it's going to just zero out by November 25th is probably not a thing. So maximizing conference contests in that window when students aren't on campus seems to make the most sense. But that's also in conflict with some MTEs and some other contracts. So it's a little bit of a chicken or the egg as it relates to that. And I think that in general, that most conferences are trying to find that happy medium between the two.
That's really interesting. And like you said, those are just a couple of my questions. I'm sure, the folks that are listening have questions. So anybody that's got a question, just jump on in there and throw it out there to Kevin. Don't be bashful. Until somebody decides to, I guess. So, Kevin, you think that, contracts after November 25th, if things happen, I guess there's going to be some universities say, we don't want our team to fly. So any games you got to fly to, we're not going to play those. Or, we don't feel safe going to an MTE. Do you think, how big a challenge is that going to be, you think?
I think it's.
Let me ask you another question. Yeah. Like, Mark Benson, my friends at Albany, right now they're in a position, if they leave the state, when they come back, they've got to quarantine for 14 days.
Yeah. Yeah. And that proves very challenging from a schedule. You don't have 14-day windows to just interject into the middle of the schedule. So that from a practical standpoint just doesn't work. So I'll say this from a contractual standpoint, that a lot of the contracts that I think that have been signed since March include more specific language as it relates to COVID and as it relates to pandemics, because in many cases we had a better feeling as to what to include in said contracts. I would hope that a lot of the changes that are going to inevitably need to take place, that those changes are agreed upon by both schools. That I don't want to be all Pollyanna about it. I mean, that there's clearly going to be some level of issues and discrepancies, but trying to work those out on the front end is going to be to everybody's benefit. Because here's the issue with the force majeure clauses. Even if you've got pretty good force majeure language that was written prior to COVID and doesn't specifically talk about COVID or give you some pretty flexible outs that you may have written in, Anything prior to that speaks more to act of God and more of complete inability to play. And if you're scheduled to play somebody on December 19th and you say, hey, we can't play this game, yada, 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 but then you're turning around and playing somebody else on December 19th, from a legal standpoint, that could be challenging depending on the verbiage that you have. So I hate to use "it depends" as an answer, but part of the reason in my mind why the NCAA didn't and couldn't take any position as it relates to those contracts. I mean, there were a few folks that were like, well, why doesn't the NCAA just say, hey, we're going to void all contracts? Well, the NCAA is a third party to all those game contracts and legally can't do that. Those contracts are between party one and party two, and in most cases nobody else. So that's where the benefit comes in trying to work things out and trying to, hey, we're going to push it to a future year. We're going to pay a little bit here now and not later. We're going to cancel a series altogether. We're going to adjust an MTE. One thing again that we've done here at Michigan State, we have not committed to any non-conference anything for any future years. And I've more or less given assurances to folks on our schedule that, hey, we're going to get this figured out, whether it's this year or a future year, before we even talk to anybody else. We're going to leave as blank a canvas for future years, so that way we have as much flexibility, because we do want to do right by folks. We've got a couple regional opponents that we're still trying to hopefully figure some things out for this year. But if we can't, like, there is just a right and wrong way to go about business, and we're trying to do it as right as we can.
How much, this is one of the questions from one of the folks that's watching, how much will TV play in controlling those non-conference games from the standpoint of, moving them around and
so I think that, I mean, television clearly is going to have some level of input, but without speaking for some of the key television networks, like their windows have adjusted significantly as well. The NBA is not going to start their season on time, so what is available through that month of December looks very different than it would in a traditional year. You've got several weeks of college football that's going to be sitting on Saturdays in December, and Saturdays in December have been prime real estate for some college basketball. That's not the case. You don't have the NBA on weeknights. So ESPN, because they don't have Wednesday and Friday NBA games, they may have significantly more windows than they would otherwise have. There's still some details yet to be determined. What does a bowl season look like on the college football side? So I think that part's a moving target. Obviously, those contracts are between conference offices and MTEs and the TV networks, but generally speaking, I think that television has tried to be incredibly flexible. They're trying to get the same. We're all trying to accomplish the same thing, and that's play as many games as possible that we can do, to the extent that we can do so safely. And for them, they've got advertising agreements, they've got carriage agreements, they've got all these other things that come up in their world that are important to them. So I've gotten the idea that they've been incredibly flexible across multiple networks that I've certainly talked with. I don't know that that's going to speak for everybody, and I don't want to have it speak just on behalf of Michigan State or any just singular deal, but I think that they're trying to make things work, because they want to make sure that they're able to televise the games that they are obligated to and frankly want to.
Kevin, how you doing? Raheem Mapp, Temple Basketball.
Hey, Raheem.
Thanks, Doc, for letting me get a part of this again as well. Just one quick question. With everything that's been released, do you still see a possibility of conferences saying, hey, we just want to do conference games only? Okay, would that be something that could come about?
So I think that it's possible. And without, again, I feel like I'm dropping sticks of dynamite and walking away. But But it's possible that depending on how the next month of college football goes, that circumstances may change for the better or for the worse in October or early November. Like I think that that's where we have to be collectively flexible as things go. I don't think that I know that there's there's a few conferences that have said that they're not playing any competition. I think the terminology has been this semester, and I don't want to split hairs for trying to decipher what that means or doesn't mean, and some of you may have better ideas. But I don't think that anybody on the basketball side has said, hey, we're starting on time and we're going conference only. It's being talked about maybe in some of your leagues, but nobody has pulled that trigger at this time, to my knowledge, full go. But it is being talked about. The positive of it is that it creates some level of control within your conference. It's a lot easier to have testing protocols that match and be able to reschedule games and adjust schedules when you have full control for 10, 12, 14 schools, as opposed to branching out beyond that. But yet also there's tremendous benefit for cross-pollination and trying to generate quality wins, or in some cases, depending on the geography of your conference, there might be 4 or 5 schools that are located within an hour's drive of your campus, and you got 4 or 5 conference opponents that are located way further away than an hour. And so that kind of throws another wrench into it, where, hey, it may be cheaper, it may be more beneficial. I mean, we haven't even really hit on the cost containment of all this yet. That look, we're all suffering financially, and so the approach to scheduling from a financial standpoint has also been affected, probably not just for this year on that side of things as well. So there's a lot there, but I think that's why each school, each conference having some level of flexibility to make the decisions that are best for them probably better suits this situation than trying to come up with a one-size-fits-all, because depending just where you're located, what your financial situation is, that could end up really dictating what's best for you.
Hey, thank you. I appreciate that. You actually spoke on what was going to lead to my next question, was just how significant the testing protocols can actually, change and take away some games. And that'll play a huge factor into that part, conference or non-conference as well.
I think it's inevitable that it will. And even in the next week or two, like I would suspect that there's going to be some teams that say, we can't meet the testing protocols that you need us to meet, or that a school may say, or may require it. The idea in general that in my mind, and in talking to a few doctors here, the minimum testing protocol for a non-conference game is going to be the stricter of the two protocols between the two competing institutions, whatever that is. And so if there's one group that's actually just has lesser testing protocols than the other, then you're going to have to meet those testing protocols. And depending on what the saliva test looks like versus other tests, and in terms of the expediency that they come back, at what point are you doing the testing, and how quickly are those results coming? Because the idea that, hey, we're going to test the day before and we'll know positives, like what we kind of saw in Major League Baseball, more in their summer camp before their season really started, they had some issues the first couple days of their camps in terms of the speed in which they were getting results. And that really affected kind of the opening of their camps, and they were able to get that figured out. But there's going to continue to be bumps in the road, depending on who you're relying on locally for your tests. If you have a spike in your community that's completely unrelated to your team or campus, that's just using medical resources in your community, that now delay the response time to be able to process this testing, that's something completely beyond your control that may factor into this. And that's, again, why why the flexibility and trying to kind of keep as much control of the schedule that you play as possible in this environment matters way more than the analytics side of it. And for those of you that know me a little bit, like for me to say that analytics don't matter as it relates to scheduling is not really a normal thing that I would be saying.
Kevin, let me ask you a question. Like for the Big Ten, they have, I think you guys have probably established your testing protocols. And then is it mandated in the Big Ten that everybody or every team that every Big Ten team plays has to follow those protocols?
So right now, the Big Ten hasn't had an event since March. So as it relates right now, there's only conference testing protocols because there's no non-conference games that are imminent. But it is a conference-wide testing protocol. It was released yesterday. I'm sure it's on the Big Ten's website if anybody wants to see or read it. But that is a universal testing protocol that applies to all 14 schools, related to all competitions involving those schools. Because there's no non-conference competition that is currently scheduled, I think that at this point there's still some time to figure that out. But I would just say logically, and don't take this as any official position. So this is just me using logic. I don't think that the Big Ten is going to permit non-conference competition against teams that do not meet whatever the Big Ten testing protocols may or may not look like at that time. Just simply that doesn't make sense.
Oh, it makes sense. I mean, but I think that has, pretty dramatic implications for.
Very much so.
Yeah, I think it does. And my guess is, the Power Five guys have probably talked some about that. Is that not? Should I not assume that? Or?
Yeah, I think that. I know that there's conversations going on with the conferences. I'm sure that there's cross-conference communication. I haven't been privy to that, so I don't want to speculate on something that I don't know. But yes, I would assume that there's been some level of communication, and that kind of gets back to where we let off the conversation, that if there's somebody on your non-conference schedule that you haven't talked to in the last 6 months, like you probably should pick up the phone today and give them a shout and just see where they're at in terms of their testing protocols, in terms of their in terms of just where are they going to be able to leave the state, to the point, Doc, that you brought up about Albany, I think it was.
Right.
That different states are going to be under different things. Like what is the lay of the land? And so I know that we met with our women's basketball staff here earlier this week and literally just went game by game, that we needed to produce a status report on each non-conference game. And it's kind of a weird conversation to have in the middle of September. But hey, we need to know, can this team travel? Can this game happen? What needs to change for it to happen? What could change where it doesn't happen? Those conversations proactively now, I think, could save a lot of angst so that there's fewer surprises down the road.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a great idea. I'd recommend to everybody they do that, to go through their non-conference schedule, find out, what everything from testing protocol to travel to whatever, I think that would make a whole lot of sense and help everybody out. Well, I don't want to monopolize this. So any other questions out here? Anybody want to jump in?
This is Ren Baker at North Texas. I would just say, having walked through the protocols with football, Kevin, I think you're right. Whoever of the two opponents has the stricter protocols is going to be the standard for that week. So we played Houston Baptist, who test once a week, and they had to test 3 times a week to meet our protocol. We're playing SNU this week, even though it's a home game at our place. They test 3 times a week, but our requirement is that only one of those 3 tests has to be a PCR swab. The other 2 can be antigen. The American requires 2 of the tests to be PCR. So we're having to adjust our protocols for this week. But each conference more or less is putting their protocols in place based upon the recommendations of their medical committee. And so the recommendations that they put and your ads and your presidents vote on are only as safe as you're holding your opponents to. They're no good if your opponent's not living up to the same standards. So for the week of competition, at least in football, you have to meet whichever team it has the stricter of the regulations for that week. Maybe in basketball we'll have a better synergy across the organization because there's supposedly a central leadership structure as opposed to football.
Hey, Kevin. Hey, I have a kind of an open-ended, and this is more of a question for everyone. And Doc, I appreciate the invite. So question for you, I was having a conversation with a friend and we're talking about the starting date, and it's great, obviously, that, we have a date and, there's some light at the end of the tunnel. I guess my question is, so we're all easing back into team practice. It seems like, I don't know, like only a handful of teams, just the people that I've talked to are actually practicing full go. So let's say you're in the non-conference, and this is just an open-ended, this could just be back to the protocol question. You're in your non-conference and, you're doing one of those 3 tests that you guys talked about. Let's say 7 of your guys test positive. Are you guys having discussions, or what discussions, or what information do you guys have with forfeitures? I know the NCAA recommended playing at least 4 non-conference, possibility to reschedule, or even for conference games. I'm just kind of interested because, like everyone else, we're easing back into team stuff. And, it's like, okay, we get to say November 22nd, and let's say we have an outbreak, and they do contact tracing, and now, 8 of our 13 are benched or sidelined for quarantine. I don't know. I'm just kind of looking for some ideas, or, maybe it comes back to doing an analysis of every, game and conference rules and kind of going about it that way. And I know there's going to be some trial and error as well.
So Brandon, I think that there's a few conferences. The Big 12 comes to mind that may have put some language out as it relates to forfeiture versus no contest, with some guidelines that has been football specific. This is secondhand information, so take it with a grain of salt. But I believe that is on the NCAA's radar, and if there hasn't been something that's distributed already, I think that there may be in the future to address that very specific point as it relates to the forfeit versus no contest.
Got it. Appreciate it.
Anybody got anything? Go ahead.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
In the Big Ten, Kevin, are you guys still keeping the 2 conference games in December, or are they going to be pushed back into January, February to try to get more non-conference?
Yes. So just for those that aren't aware, traditionally the Big Ten on the men's side has played 2 conference games in kind of the early December window. I would term it this way, that I think that is to be determined, and I also I think that it's safe to say that if there's non-conference as it relates to an MTE, or if there's something that comes up that needs to utilize that window, I think that flexibility could exist. But to the extent that is a thing, I think is still open-ended. I'll tell you that from a Big Ten standpoint, I think that it's going to take some time for this to evolve. Maybe not just Big Ten, maybe for everybody. And right now, I think that everybody's kind of reacting to number of games and, hey, where should some things go? Waiting on television, frankly, in terms of just Gavitt games, for instance. Gavitt games typically takes place before November 25th. There's a couple MTEs that take place before that. Champions Classic takes place before that. Can those be moved into a different part of the calendar? I think that those decisions need to be made first, and it'll frankly have some impact as to what may happen for those conferences that play games in early December. I think that flexibility is the name of the game, and that decisions haven't been made, not because people haven't talked about it, not because people haven't worked on it, but because they want to keep as much as it relates to open dialogue and flexibility as possible. So I think that in short, is that window sacrosanct for Big Ten or any other conference in terms of playing conference games that have to be in that window? No, I don't think it's sacrosanct.
The question is, was there any talk within the NCAA about not mandating that 3 consecutive days off?
Yeah. So there's a 3-day window of no countable athletically related activity over essentially the Christmas break. I'm not privy to how that conversation went. I know that it was discussed to some level. I also know firsthand that there's more than a few coaches and administrators that are concerned about sending their student athletes home for Christmas and then coming back and trying to essentially reset what testing may look like. And people are essentially leaving your kind of team bubble, if you will, to go back home. And we've seen that already when some student athletes and some just folks on the general student body were sent home and came back, they had contracted the virus. So that 3-day window has not been waived. It is still in place. But I know that there's a lot of concern around that. The flip side of it is that to essentially mandate that everybody must stay over the Christmas holiday, there's some ramifications on that side of it too. So it's an incredibly tricky topic. But I know that there's an appetite among more than a few to at least address it. But as it sits right now, that 3-day period, that 3-day dead period of no activity during a time period that each individual school would choose is still in play.
Thanks, Kevin. I think we're kind of starting to run, a little bit long now. We've been on for about 50 minutes. And, I think clearly, your input has been tremendous. We really thank you for doing this, taking time out. But I also, I'd like to ask you, I know you have your scheduling system called Factor. If people want to get on the Factor or use it, how do they go about doing that?
Yeah, so like I kind of alluded to earlier, and I appreciate you bringing that up. What we've done is at factorsports.com, so FAKTOR sports.com. Essentially, we're taking those that are the primary schedulers for each institution. Can include an AD, can include a coach, an administrator, whoever it is. Unlimited logins per school. Just tell us who's in charge. We'll get you set up with a username and password, and then set permissions accordingly as well, so that you can go in, you can enter your schedule, and then search for games as well. We're not nearly at 350 teams that have done so far, but we're pushing hard to try and get people to do that. Full disclosure, we've decided that it's going to be completely free, at least through this academic year. Eventually, we're going to need to pay the bill for the servers and whatnot that it's sitting on, but we'll figure that out later. But again, we've been working on this even pre-COVID, and frankly, the need for it is too great. So we've kind of got a beta version that can at least get us all started and hopefully kind of play matchmaker. I've joked that in some ways it's both a matchmaking tool and an analytics tool at the same time. It's kind of Tinder meets TurboTax for scheduling, and hopefully it'll prove helpful. So at the top left hand corner of the screen, you can create a username, create a password, that sends an automated email to us where then we can assign permissions and send you a confirmation, and then you can go on your way. So we're trying to spread the word, just because, again, the goal here really is that if all that we accomplish out of that is some sanity and get some people some games that they need, then mission accomplished. So that is available.
Thanks, Kevin. Like I said, I hope everybody got their questions answered. I'm sure if they have any other questions, they can probably email you, and we'd be
Yes.
glad to respond. And really appreciate it. Once again, we will. Michael Ruud, who works with us and does all the technology, he'll eventually get this we recorded, so that'll be up on on our YouTube site. And then also, like I said earlier, if you go in and subscribe to my other YouTube site, From the Locker Room with Coach and Doc, that'd be great. So appreciate everybody, and thanks. And Kevin, great job, man. Appreciate you.
Thanks for having me. Appreciate it, guys.